What is up, group members? I'm licensed psychologist Dr. Kristen Casey.
I'm licensed psychologist Dr. Jessica Rabon.
I'm licensed psychologist Dr. J.
And I'm licensed clinical social worker Kristen Gingrich.
It is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD Awareness Month. Today we're going to be talking to you about PTSD and post-traumatic growth. So settle in, take a seat, and welcome to group therapy. Last week we explored men's mental health, and we asked you what is one way that you're going to check in with a man in your life about their mental health. And you said create space where he could talk about how he's feeling without judgment.
Yes.
That was solid. He might come off as angry, and I'll try to remember that he might be worried or anxious or experiencing other emotions.
That one.
Help with healthy boundaries.
Love it.
This is a really good one. Openness. So being available and being there for him. If he needs to tell me anything. And actually, this one's really good. So somebody said, actually, I did this after I heard this podcast. I brought up that I listened to a pod about men's mental health and that society can make it hard for men to talk about their feelings. But I let him know that I'm here to talk and I'm not here to judge.
I love it.
I know. That's really cute. So I want to start with some stats about PTSD. So we might not know the exact number of people who struggle with PTSD, but we have some pretty good estimates in the United States for adults, according to the National Center for PTSD. So there are about 6 out of every 100 people, so 6% of the U.S. population, will have PTSD at some point in their lives. Many people who have PTSD will recover and won't meet diagnostic criteria anymore if they do seek out PTSD treatment. So this number kind of counts the people who have PTSD at any point in their life, not if they just have it throughout their entire life, even if their symptoms go away. About 5 in every 100 adults, so 5%, has PTSD in any given year. So I know these stats are a little different. And when we look at numbers, I always like to look at, is it the yearly thing? Is it in their lifetime? And the last one that I think is really interesting is women are more likely to develop PTSD than men. 8 in every 100. Yeah. And then for men, it's 4 in every 100. So interesting. So let's jump into some symptoms about PTSD. Can anyone enlighten us?
Some hypovigilance.
What's that?
That's true. What is that?
When you are it's like you're hyper aware of your environment. You're always on edge. You're always looking over your shoulder. A lot of people with hypervigilance, they might sit with their back to the wall. You're it's kind of that feeling of you're just waiting for that next shoe to drop and you're looking for the shoe.
Yeah.
I like that.
One thing I think I'm going to use the word cool about PTSD, but I don't mean it in like cool that way, but it's the only mental health disorder we have that there is one common cause compared to any other mental health disorder. So wow. PTSD, to have PTSD, you have to be exposed to a traumatic event. You can't have PTSD without exposure to trauma. And I know there's a lot of feelings about this, but how it's defined in the DSM is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And I think that's important to note because as we've talked in other episodes, when people ask like, what causes anxiety? Like there are so many factors. And yes, there's other predisposing factors that increase your risk for PTSD, but you have to be exposed to a traumatic event. I think of like the flashbacks or nightmares, intrusive memories, things like that.
I was just going to break down what exposure means a little bit of like, if you might not have seen it firsthand, but you might have heard about it.
Absolutely.
Where I just did a trauma training and they talked about that, the secondhand exposure. And that wasn't really, they didn't really talk about that thing until when do you think they talked about it? What event
9/11?
do you think? 9/11. I just learned that 9/11 was the tipping point of where we talked a lot, where they started talking about something called vicarious trauma, that witnessing, that you didn't actually experience it, but you kind of witnessed it secondhand. So because individuals who weren't even there that day started expressing symptoms of PTSD. So individuals in New York City who weren't even at the towers, or even people who were in, Pennsylvania or Ohio. They were close, but they were not there. They started experiencing those symptoms. So there has definitely, even over the course of time, has been this kind of switch in what can constitute the development of PTSD.
Yeah.
And
I really like that you. I really like that you brought it up too, because I think things can change over time too. Like when we read the DSM, like verbatim, you know what I mean? I think that obviously like things change over time, but who knows? I mean, even if you have a trauma experience, you might not, I'm putting this in air quotes, but like meet criteria for PTSD, but you might have a flavor of it. You know what I mean? So I know that we talk a lot about like the diagnostic criteria, and I know that some people are really concerned about labels and like putting themselves in these categories. And I mean, I think about vicarious trauma, like you said. I even think about like, I'm just pulling from like being a first responder. Technically, did I witness certain things? No. Was I there for the aftermath? Absolutely. Was that traumatic? Yes. You know, so it's like, how do you categorize it? You know, would I say I have PTSD, or would I say I have vicarious trauma? It just depends, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Another symptom that comes to mind that's kind of hallmark is disturbances in memory. So you can get into talking about dissociation, but also just thinking that people have lapses in memory of what occurred during parts of that. And sometimes those memory lapses continue on. And we had mentioned like flashbacks or other bouts of dissociation. But when I'm thinking PTSD, that's one of those hallmark symptoms I'm thinking about is memory lapses.
I also think of like avoidance of things that remind you of the trauma. So like maybe certain places, certain smells, certain people, objects, things like that.
Yeah. I even think like based on that traumatic event, your view of the world and like other people might change, you know, after, which makes sense. You might not trust people the same, or you might feel a little triggered by certain things or certain experiences, but you might really think about the world, your life, other people way differently than you did before.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking the mood fluctuations, irritability.
Oh, yeah.
Probably maybe one of the most hallmark ones, but I know KB, I had mentioned the hypervigilance, but then I think of that being startled and being irritable, and then you can be anxious. There's just a lot of mood fluctuation that we tend to see with people with PTSD.
Yeah.
And K10, I'm surprised you haven't brought up sleep disturbance.
I know.
It's just at the end of the diagnostic criteria, so I don't want to jump ahead. But yeah, sleep disturbances. I mean, a lot of times people experience difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep. And then we also work a lot with, when people have PTSD, they might have, you know, a co-occurring nightmare disorder, you know, or it might be related to the PTSD. So it's kind of captured there. So people might actually feel a little fearful about falling asleep. And I can't speak for everybody with PTSD, but when I worked at the VA, a lot of the veterans would tell me like, I am fine all day, but then when I'm about to go to sleep, I know that I don't have a sense of control of what I'm going to dream about. And that makes me so nervous. So I think that could really impact things. And even if you don't have nightmares, just the fact that people might just have issues with sleep in general. I noticed that too.
I also think it's important to note, because I see this in the hospital a lot. I get consulted for PTSD for a trauma that just happened. And I like have to educate the residents and stuff. Like it hasn't been a month, and per the criteria that these symptoms have to have occurred for at least a month. Otherwise, it's acute stress disorder. But that's something I see a lot in the hospital. You know, I'll get consulted for PTSD on a car accident. I'm like, yes, this is actually very traumatic. They're having a lot of symptoms, and it's not PTSD. So that 1 month duration is also pretty key.
Well, because a lot can change for a lot of people. Sometimes that month gets them to a point where they don't meet criteria for PTSD. Maybe in that moment, right, they're going to meet that criteria minus the time frame. But like a lot of times for certain individuals, depending like that month, they may be able to process and work through to a point where it's not, yes, it's still impactful. Like they're not going to work through that trauma in 1 month and say, hey, all's good. But they work to the point where they're not entering into that criteria of PTSD.
Yeah.
And then just to say on the other side, right, you even have the lower level of adjustment disorder of like, hey, I'm really struggling with a lot of changes that are not great in my life, but maybe it doesn't reach that level of acute stress. And so there's definitely like so many different levels when we're working with trauma and really just looking at them all. But I know today, like we're really just focused on that PTSD.
Yeah. I love that you talk about like the differential diagnosis, right? Because I think there's just so many different areas and avenues that you could go when you experience trauma, or when you're experiencing intense stress. And I even think too, for people who, like you said, KBI might not meet the criteria after a month. I even think about people who go through a traumatic experience and might not have any symptoms at all. You know, they might actually experience something, and for some reason, it doesn't affect them in the same way that it might affect someone else. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. But not everybody who experiences a traumatic event will necessarily meet criteria. And I think that's important to highlight too.
Well, I think Absolutely. That there are lots of things that play into that, right? I mean, I think sometimes the biggest thing that plays into if something shows, and I know that there has been talk about this, is did you have the ability to talk openly about what happened with someone that was safe and trusted? And did you get the validation and support? Like that is one of the big key components of when you experience a traumatic event to lessen the impact of it entering into the PTSD area. Is did you have a space where you could openly talk and freely talk and gain that validation and support for that? Now, again, you could still have that and still experience PTSD symptoms and things like that. But I know that that is one of the most important protective factors when it comes to that.
So KBI, when you were talking about like kind of the different levels, so to speak, like adjustment disorder, acute stress disorder, obviously we're talking about PTSD today. I feel like we just need to address CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I know that's not what we're focusing on today. There's so much to cover with that. So I feel like in the future, we should probably do a full episode on that. But I know, at least from what I have seen on social media, that is a really like hot topic, something talked about a lot. So does anybody want to touch on what CPTSD is versus PTSD?
Yeah. I mean, PTSD, the way that it's being defined, the differences is PTSD tends to be a one-off incident, maybe to that type of thing, where CPTSD tends to be relational trauma, like a relational trauma. So abuse, neglect, something that has happened consistently over a long period of time that tends to really be focused in a relationship with another individual. That is how commonly I hear it defined. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add or disagrees or agrees.
Yeah, I agree. The duration is a big part of the difference. And there's a few other symptoms that for complex PTSD that tend to be highlighted, which is the emotional regulation, the fluctuating sense of identity, and how it creates lasting change in your relationships. Yeah. If you've listened to any of our episodes, you should have heard those three and thought of another disorder and been like, I
wonder what it is.
An episode where we might have had a very popular guest on who goes by the name of Dr. Courtney Tracy. And so true. You should go back and listen to that episode. I think it's just a great episode and you'll learn a lot. But there's a lot of overlap with CPTSD and borderline personality disorder to the point where a lot of people wonder, is there a difference? Because we know highly correlative that people who have BPD have past trauma histories. So again, there's a good debate going on of like, what's the difference between CPTSD and BPD aside from with CPTSD, you clearly are defining exactly what KBI laid out, like this ongoing relational trauma. And with BPD, it may or may not be there, but there's some people, and we've had this conversation before, that if you've worked a lot with individuals with BPD, there's almost always trauma. Anyways, very interesting. We'll have to talk a lot more, but what other things did I forget about CPTSD before we bury it for another episode?
Well, I think it's important to note that technically speaking, it is not an official diagnosis.
Oh, that's really good too.
It is still so
right.
you may feel like you qualify under that CPTSD. It's kind of been coined by mental health professionals. We so badly want it to be a diagnosis because we see the difference in the presentation. But for anybody listening who's like, I have this, but my doctor won't give me anything but PTSD, it's because that diagnosis doesn't actually, quote unquote, exist in this little book that drives our entire medical field.
I think it exists according to the world as you just pitch it. Get this little book out of here.
Get out of here.
The pocket size is the way to go, by the way.
It is.
Really
I have the big one hidden somewhere. It has tabs.
Yeah,
and
that's like a blunt object.
We're not throwing that.
If you know, you know. But I believe the World Health Organization has adopted and accepted it. Yeah. I can tell by Jess's face that Jess is on it to confirm or deny.
Because I know that there was a talk to make it either its own separate diagnosis or make it even a specifier in that, because it like you said, Justin, it does present very differently than again, someone who may have just experienced, and I'm not trying to downplay a car accident, but someone who maybe just experienced a car accident, right? Both very significant in their own trauma, but the way that trauma occurred, especially that relationship trauma, if it occurred as like a child during your attachment, during your trust during all of those developmental stages, it definitely changes the way that you see the world for sure.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on a... Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it is in the ICD-11.
Ooh, really?
Love that.
Yep. 6B41, complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Interesting.
It might be coming.
Oh,
what were we going to say, Keaton?
It's on the come up. I was thinking, KB, I just wanted to validate your point too. I think when we're thinking about the DSM and all of that, I think sometimes it's not captured as a diagnosis, air quotes, because insurance companies and all that stuff. Like I could go on and on about that, but sometimes insurance companies want a diagnosis, and if it is CPTSD and your provider isn't giving you that diagnosis, essentially, they might think about your insurance and all that stuff. There might be more to it than that, So yeah, important to note.
Yep. But I definitely would love to do it, and we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do another episode on it. I'm down.
We'll do a wrap around and we'll do it again.
Just a wrap around. I love it. Yeah.
So I guess one question I want to pose to you all is, we just defined a lot of symptoms of PTSD. If somebody comes into your office presenting with symptoms of PTSD, what are some of your go-to strategies, interventions to help individuals work through it?
My first step, a lot of times, and I pull this, I'm trained in TFCBT, so that's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I use it intermittently because sometimes I don't agree with the model for certain clients. But one of the things that we really focus on in that is really focusing on the ability to regulate and developing a solid set of coping skills before we can even enter into any form of that trauma work. Because for a lot of individuals, you're going to be entering into the uncomfy and the overwhelm, and you're going to be reliving that. And if you don't have the skills to kind of regulate yourself and to cope, you're going to open up Pandora's box and not be able to even close the lid. Mm-hmm. But the goal is that we can open that box up in therapy and close that box up when you leave therapy, and that you can open it up and close it as needed as you work through it.
I love that analogy. That's or a metaphor. Mm-hmm. Analogy, metaphor? Yeah, metaphor. Have to think about that one. I guess when people come to me, I worked at the VA for a while, and we usually did prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy. And there were a lot of people there who did EMDR as well. When people come to me, the first thing I always ask them is like, what is your goal with your trauma? Like, do you want to get to a place where you feel like it doesn't affect you as much? Do you want to get to a place where you can go out in the world? Like, what are your actual in real life goals, right? And then based on that, we kind of choose somewhat of a treatment that could guide us. There are evidence-based treatments out there, like I just talked about, prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. But really, I like to take the tenets of that and kind of mold it into the therapy session. I feel like therapy is a science and an art. So if we were just to do the manualized treatments, I feel like sometimes we do miss things. So even though they're really helpful, they're rooted in research and science. But I like to get their goals first. And then the whole point, in my opinion, y'all can disagree with me, but the whole point of trauma treatment, especially for PTSD, is to reduce avoidance, because avoidance makes everything bigger. If you're going to reduce the avoidance, you might have to, like KBI said, get a little uncomfy. And the whole point is so that we could talk about it. And when you're out in the world, it doesn't affect you nearly as much. So.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think setting expectations, setting goals, seeing what kind of coping strategies people have, how informed they are about regulation. Can they activate their parasympathetic nervous system and rest and digest and regulate? I mean, all that assessment up front is really important. For a long time, I practiced mainly from a narrative, emotion-focused kind of trauma approach, where it was more about accessing emotions that were kind of either suppressed, pushed aside, that happened through the course of the trauma. More recently, I've been trained, as I've talked about on this podcast, in ART, accelerated resolution therapy, which is much more manualized. So my approach was more unstructured, let the client take the lead, asking more open-ended questions, going through the narrative of their experience, trying to tap into those emotions. And it's sort of unstructured in that. And if in the settings I worked in, I found it very effective. Would I use that approach in someone who has more of a severe, who's having a lot of flashbacks and severe symptoms? Probably not. But ART and EMDR that have much more of a structured approach, I think do better at sort of, this is my own opinion, take it for what it's worth, do better if it's a more moderate to severe. And I've seen that in my own practice. And so I think that's the cool thing about being a therapist is we're always learning, growing, and getting different trainings. I tend to be pretty unstructured. So for me, getting a structured, manualized approach helped me immensely to help clients in a different way.
Yeah. I love that. Jess, what about you?
No, I was going to say, Justin, I love that you brought up art, but also the narrative therapy. So I'm also trained in TFCBT, working with primarily children and adolescents. And I think we've mentioned this on the podcast. I know KBI and I have at least discussed it. Like, it doesn't always work for everybody, especially if you don't have a safe person. But I definitely take more of a narrative approach. Obviously, learning coping skills, emotion regulation skills, things like that. And then a narrative approach to the trauma, especially because I don't specialize in PTSD. So most of the trauma I see is medical trauma. And so I feel like the narrative of getting diagnosed, you know, how this has changed your life. And I know we'll touch on this here shortly, but like the growth that can come of it. I use like an ACT-based approach for, you know, once we've processed the trauma, kind of looking forward, values work, things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked a lot about already, right? We've talked about the signs and the symptoms, what trauma is. We've talked about kind of some different ways that we approach it. But then the question comes up is, do we ever recover from it? Do we ever recover from trauma? Like, do we ever recover from that diagnosis? I know we've talked about that, you know, across several episodes of like, will I ever be free of this? And so that kind of brings up the term that I know of called post-traumatic growth. Have you guys heard that term before?
Yep. I love post-traumatic growth. So going back to your original question, KBI, and we've talked about this on the podcast. Like, yes, there's definitely times that individuals can at one point meet criteria for PTSD and then no longer. It doesn't mean that the trauma is gone or that, you know, they don't still experience, you know, some memories that are uncomfortable of the trauma, and, you know, the reactions related to the trauma are not impacting them on a daily basis. But when I think of post-traumatic growth, I really think of like any positive, like the positive psychological change, positive that can come from a traumatic event, which can be hard to conceptualize, I think, especially initially when you're going through a trauma, like, why did this happen to me? How could anything good come of this? But there is actually a lot of really cool research out there on post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, so I can actually conceptualize this and just kind of conceptualize this for the group members is that I am in post-traumatic growth. I, very open about my trauma, experienced trauma, had a period of my time where I met criteria. I no longer meet criteria for PTSD. Does that mean my trauma is gone? Absolutely not. But I no longer meet the diagnosable criteria. But I'm also entering into post-traumatic growth. And for me, that is, I've acknowledged my history. I've grappled with it. I've processed it. I'm healing from it. And I'm using that to propel me forward to make different life choices for myself, to do things differently, to do things from a different approach than maybe what I had, and to be more aware of my environment and choices that I'm making so that I do not repeat that. So that can, like, to kind of conceptualize that, what that can look like. Because for many people, post-traumatic growth is just, I no longer meet that criteria. It could be I'm doing one thing differently. I learned this one thing and it's helping me move forward. I
love this for you. This is so cool.
But it's definitely, it takes a lot of work to get there. There are times I still have flashbacks, and that's something like as we kind of work through that and we get to the other end of PTSD, like it doesn't mean I like to say, like, it's not, you don't get to a point in your life where the trauma never happened, because we can't do that. But what you get to is that the trauma no longer drives the bus. It no longer has control. Yeah. And that's post-traumatic growth.
I love the way that you conceptualize that. And I love the fact that you're on this journey, and I'm, because we're all really close friends. I seriously love this for you. Seriously, because I think
this for me too.
I really do. It's amazing because trauma is so deep and so heavy and so like isolating and lonely sometimes too. And to get to a point where you feel like you have a sense of control over your life again, or your triggers, is like the most beautiful thing. I even think too, for some people they might think, oh, am I ever going to be able to live life and not be affected? For some people, maybe, it looks different for everybody based on the trauma, how long it happened, all these things. I also think just even noticing when you're becoming triggered is such a growth moment for most people that they often overlook. Like if you notice like, oh, I'm out of my window of tolerance right now, that's a big step for most people who've experienced trauma. And I try to help my clients through that. Like we could expand the window of tolerance by reducing avoidance and using some skills, or you could acknowledge like, I'm out of my window of tolerance and I need to remove myself. Right. So even just these small pivots are really, really helpful. And I see that as growth too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think of other big categories of change when we talk about post-traumatic growth is knowing and understanding your values, understanding your strengths to work through and get through difficulties, having an increased appreciation for life. And for a lot of people, starting to reflect on what is your spiritual, religious, even if you decide it's non-existent, but just the expansion of the mind into spirituality in general. These are all things we experience. A lot of people experience when they have periods of post-traumatic growth. And again, it doesn't mean, like we say till we're blue in the face. If some people hear that term, they get really mad. They're like, my trauma was not a good thing. Totally get that. And two things can be true. It can be not a good thing, and you can experience these changes that make you look at the world better. And I know my brother and dad dying for me was that perfect example. The ways I value and appreciate life, having lost both of them, is a moment of growth for me. Where like without that trauma, without experienced death and loss, there's no way I'd have the appreciation for how short our time can be here and how much variability exists within that, which for me makes me cherish and cultivate moments of gratitude that I definitely did not have before. I'm not saying I was a miserable person before that, but there's a different appreciation for life knowing that it's going to end. And I know people who have experienced grief and loss, they're nodding to that. They're like, yeah, it's a different thing that we don't know how much time we're going to have here.
I love that, because I think it's almost like, if you really, really think about it, it's kind of the opposite of when you're experiencing PTSD and you're really in the midst of it. You can't see that. I mean, the way that you're looking at life is just so different, and it's so dark, So when people do have those moments, it's amazing. I love everybody sharing today. I think it's beautiful. And I think too, it's just, I think sometimes people don't realize that like if you've had a traumatic experience happen to you, you might think that I'm going to feel this exact same way for the rest of my life.
Exactly.
And perhaps you might, if, you don't really look at it, or if you don't reduce avoidance, of course, but time always changes things too, So I think for anybody out there struggling who like really wants to take action and they don't really know what to do, just knowing that everything in life does change essentially. So there's going to be a time when you don't feel this low. And I think that's in the midst of my PTSD too. It was really hard for me to see that, because I'm like, fuck, this is going to be the rest of my life. Like, this is going to be so hard, but it always changes.
And I think it's really important to remember that trauma is so individual, like, and recovery is so individual that you like cannot compare where you are on your journey to anybody else. It doesn't matter. Like, and we even talk about like even siblings, like two siblings could go through the quote unquote exact trauma, but you didn't go through the exact trauma because you're two different people with two different experiences. Right. And so I always have to remind, like, especially like when I would see kiddos and like, they'll be like, well, my sibling like is fine with it. And I'm like, yes, but that's your sibling. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you, that you're doing something wrong. Like, I always say this is a super like nuance, but like it could just come down to like, you like purple, that he likes blue. It comes down to like stupid things in the way that you cope. It could be that his friend called him to talk to him the night of, and your friend called you the next day. It's these stupid nuances that make everything so different that you can't, that you don't have control over. And so, so it's also remembering, like, we cannot compare our journey of healing and recovery to anybody else on the planet.
Yeah. And I think I love everything that y'all are saying. And I think, especially if people are listening and they're like, okay, how do I get there? Like, I'm,
what do I do?
I'm in my trauma. I want to get to that stage of post-traumatic growth. And I think KBI, you so beautifully said when you shared your experience, and Justin as well, like, part of post-traumatic growth is it happens naturally as you work through your trauma. So like, getting psychoeducation about what trauma is. And I know we've touched on that in other episodes, and, learning those emotion regulation skills, learning those distress tolerance, learning how to regulate your nervous system, creating a narrative, like Justin said, disclosing the trauma, having that, safe person like KBI brought up earlier. And through all that, naturally is when you can start seeing some of those positives, that appreciation for life, relationships with others, new possibilities, things like that. Another area, and I've seen this a lot, actually, kids amaze me all the time, but especially like my chronic illness kiddos, through like service. So I can't tell you how many kids and teens I've worked with that have started like YouTube channels where they talk about their chronic illness and like share their day in and day out, or have started nonprofits, like kids and teens, because they're giving back to others. They took their traumatic experience, and granted, I'm talking in a bubble of medical trauma here, and are doing something, or like starting a support group, volunteering, advocating for, policy change depending on what's going on. And that service and feeling like you can give back can also cultivate that growth as well.
I love that. Gives me so many ideas. And I think even when you think about like the medical trauma, because I'm experiencing something really close to home with that right now, it's so nice to know that other people are experiencing it. But even furthermore, it's so nice to see people experience something and grow from that, and be able to kind of live their life again. And I think when you share your stories, anybody out there who has experiences with this, like when you share your stories, you inadvertently like really, really make people feel seen. And it's incredible. Just sharing your journey is helpful. If you feel comfortable, you don't have to.
You know what else is incredible?
That was going to be what I was going to say.
I knew it. I saw you to move your lips, Jen.
I did not miss the cheesy transitions.
I love the cheesy transitions. I live for them.
You missed it. I can tell by the glimmer in your eyes.
I'm just too busy eating muffins.
Oh my gosh. I know.
We're done.
I'm sorry for you.
So yes, we love the Google Scholar Shorts. They're incredible. That's the word we used. And also, I'm glad we kind of ended on medical trauma because we know the pandemic has been traumatic for many people, especially healthcare workers, those on the front lines. So the question I'm going to pose to you all, if you had to estimate the percentage of healthcare workers that experience post-traumatic growth throughout the pandemic, and granted, this is based on one study, but where would you put that?
22%.
22. 2%. KBS is 0.
I said 0, 2%. I'll give some credit. 2%. I can't even imagine. I mean, I can't even.
I was going to say 10%, but I feel like that's, I don't even know. Just enlighten us. I have no idea.
It feels so high. I don't know.
You don't know. So this study actually came out in 2022. I didn't get a 2023 study that looked at post-traumatic growth in healthcare workers. And surprisingly to you all, 76.8% endorsed at least moderate levels of post-traumatic growth, most prevalently in the domains of greater appreciation for life. So 67% indicated that, improved relationships, which was 48.7%, and personal strength, 44.1%.
Wow.
And this was
to get there.
a two-wave study. So frontline healthcare workers who screened positive for pandemic-related PTSD symptoms at the first wave of the study were significantly more likely than those who screened negative to endorse all aspects of post-traumatic growth at wave 2, which was 7 months later, except for relating to others. And I learned a great deal about how wonderful people were. So those that experienced PTSD actually showed, or higher levels of PTSD showed higher post-traumatic growth 7 months later. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight was endorsement of pandemic-related spiritual changes was associated with a 44% lower odds of screening positive for burnout and 52% lower odds of screening positive for pandemic-related PTSD symptoms.
That makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that last part really,
But I was shocked it was that high.
Yeah, too.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just think of all of my friends who left the field.
Mm-hmm. And maybe
So,
that was their personal strength. They're like, I'm stronger by setting this boundary.
Yeah.
But some of those categories make sense, like appreciation for life. To me, I'm like, oh, duh. Like, I guess when you go into the subcategories, you're like, because that one was like, of course, in a way. But some of the other ones, the relationships.
Like improved relationships.
Right.
That actually surprised me.
I was surprised too.
I wonder, this is like, for healthcare. I'm thinking of I don't know why, I'm just thinking of people in their homes kind of quarantining, right? And they're stuck with their people. It's like, oh my God. Like, I don't know if that kind of helped. I would imagine that it could go either way, but.
This is a good Google scholarship.
Yeah.
I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as always, the link will be in the show notes for anybody that's interested, but know what else people are interested in? Especially you all? The polls.
Let's do it.
So the first question I asked, have you or someone you know been diagnosed with PTSD? Options were yes, no, unsure, or not a formal diagnosis, but I think either I or they have it. What do you think was the number one response?
That
last one. That long-winded one felt like a catch-all, and I like it. I just think
when you have a multiple choice test, the one that, it's like that one's definitely the winner. But maybe
that's the right answer. Click.
Yeah.
So that was actually the second top one at 15%.
Probably yes.
Yes was number one at 68%.
There we go.
And then no was 10 and unsure was 7%. Okay.
Wow.
Have you heard of the term post-traumatic growth? The options were yes, and I know what it means. Yes, but I'm not sure what it means. Or no, this is a new term for me.
Yes, and not sure.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So 54% of our group members said, no, this is a new term for me.
Wow.
So group members, I hope you learned something.
Hope you learned a little tidbit here and there.
Okay. So the next one, you have been listening intently so far to the stats that K10 dropped at the beginning. According to the National Center for PTSD, about blank % of people will experience PTSD at some point in their lives. 4, 6, 8, or 12%.
Well, we know 6 is right, but like, what did they guess? I'm trying to think.
I think they went higher. I bet they would have thought more.
Yeah.
I think they were like, wow, those are really low numbers.
Yeah.
We're all traumatized.
Yeah. So you all are correct. So the most frequently guessed one was 8 at 40%, followed by 12 at 29%, then 6 at 24, and 4 at 7. So
Dang.
yeah, I was actually surprised it was that low.
Yeah.
Dang, shorty.
Okay. K10 also answered this for us at the beginning.
Fuck,
Women
really
are
mess it
more
up?
likely to develop PTSD than men. True or false?
True.
So it is true. What do you all think our group members answered?
I feel like they think men have more, but I think well, I'm biased because I worked at the VA and I worked mostly with men, so maybe I'm just the pool and the sample that I had was really small compared to the bigger population.
KBI looks like she's
I got
thinking
so many
intently.
theories around that.
Okay. So this was really interesting. I'm not going to run a chi-squared analysis, but I don't think this is statistically different. True is 52% and false is 48%. So it is true, but like our group members were pretty much, split.
It's a good question then.
Damn.
Yeah.
Good question.
Crazy.
Okay. And then what words of hope or encouragement do you have for someone currently experiencing PTSD? I did not read these in advance because like every other female on this podcast, I cry. You are not alone. You are safe. You are loved. I'll be right here for you. Don't give up. It will get easier. Be kind to yourself. There is a destination of health and happiness at the end of this journey. I just found mine. Okay, I'm going to cry.
Oh my God, my heart is bursting.
Feelings.
We got to stop doing these open questions. I don't want to be crying in the club every week. Shit.
God.
You are not your trauma. Your fight is not in vain. You will make it out of this. You deserve every bit of joy that comes your way. You are so much more than what happened to you. Okay, I have to start. Okay, we need to start. We're going to make a post of these because we got so many.
Yeah.
Oh, somebody sent.
I know.
Oh, wait, I can show this because we have video. Somebody sent a little keep going image.
Oh,
This is very
Just
nice.
go cry in the corner.
I know. I think this gives like information that we all need to hear these things from time to time when we're going through stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't have a good transition because I'm crying.
I was just saying, we also all need to hear the group member questions.
Yes, we do.
Justin comes in with a save.
Now I'm just reflecting on after our men's episode last week. I'm like, why am I not emotional? And you know what? I've been emotional many times throughout this podcast. So
You have.
I'll just say maybe it is my man defense up, but that's neither here nor there. We love your group member questions. We look forward to them. Always thoughtful, great. We also love it. We're getting some new writer inners. That's a technical term. You might have to look it up. Listen, you don't go to school for 11 years.
I can't believe you just said that.
The writer inners. But we love repeat writer inners as well. Plenty. We see similar names and location, and we love that too. Okay. But also like people popping up. I'm like, I haven't heard from this person before. Maria from Jersey. Is that how you say it? Jersey. Jersey. Maria says, I like this. This was a thoughtful question. What's it like up front watching someone diagnosed with PTSD grow and change with therapy through the course of treatment? What is that like?
Oh my God. These are all tearjerker questions. I can't.
It is.
It's the most beautiful thing.
The most sacred thing.
Yeah. I just love.
Yeah.
I love when people reclaim their power in their life. They're like, how do I explain it? When somebody's going through something and then they actually really, really, really try to reclaim their sense of self, their power, the control that they have over their life, even though like the PTSD or the trauma might be so overwhelming, but just even seeing them like put themselves first and prioritize their treatment. I mean, it brings me to tears after sessions sometimes to see clients just go through that. And I think it's just, like you said, it's sacred. I think therapy is sacred. But yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, for someone to sit in our office on Zoom, whatever, and to open to their core and to show sometimes the darkest things that have happened to them and be able to talk openly about that and be that identified safe person for them. Like, there's not really a way to put that into words other than like, I am always so thankful for my clients for trusting me to enter that space, because as someone who had to enter that space, it is not an easy thing to do, because innately as humans, we don't want to sit in that space. Yeah. Our bodies tell us to run in the opposite direction. And so to be that person for someone else, like, I go back to like, that's a very sacred place to be in.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I want to add, I agree with everything that's been said, is one of the, I guess, highlights of therapy for me is when I can tell my client is proud of themselves for something they did, that they saw change, or something that, you know, once again, I'm very narrow in my focus when it comes to trauma. A lot of times it's a lot of medical trauma, or like I do like car accidents, gunshot wounds, things like that. But, you know, when a client comes to me and is like, I did this thing that I haven't been able to do since the traumatic event, or, you know, I slept through the night without having a nightmare and I finally got a good night's sleep. And you can just tell that like they see their progress and growth. For me, that's one of the most powerful things in therapy, because to any group member listening, if you're in therapy, you want to be in therapy, like, you're doing the work. We're sitting there teaching you skills, holding space for you, but you're the one doing the work. And at least for me, when my client sees the hard work that they're putting in, paying off, and excitedly share something and see their growth, like, that's it for me. Like, I love that.
It's so badass. Yeah.
Yeah. This is why we got into this field. Yeah. A lot of talk goes into, like, what do you like about being a therapist? What are the downsides or whatever? It's not a field you go into to get rich. I hate to burst your bubble. It ain't really the field. But every therapist and mental health worker listening to everything we've just said is thinking about a particular client they've worked with. Yeah. And that is what you're left with, having been in this field a long time, is you're left with these stories and this remarkable change that's such a privilege to see and witness. I can't think of anything better in any field that exists. I'm sure people in medical professions, saving lives, I'm sure there's parallels, okay? But I don't see anything better. Nothing better. I don't care who you are out there. Architect. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Cool building. Ain't as cool as seeing someone grow and change. There's some architect driving right now, like, why?
What if they build?
He's like, why is he attacking me?
What if they built the building that you do therapy in? Like,
you know,
full circle. Give them a break.
Yeah. Justin, we just lost any group member that is an architect.
That's like, what?
Like, screw this. Yeah.
I think architecture is super cool. I don't know why that jumped into my mind.
But it is so different though. Like, I will agree, like, right? Every job has its importance. Just like, but like, I know plenty of, I always go to the accountants, right? It's very logical, very like black and white numbers. Like, they don't want to touch this work with a 10-foot pole. They're like, feelings? You talk about feelings all day? What? Yeah. And I'm like, you do numbers all day. Why? Like, and I think like that's where it comes, like, even to our position, right? It takes a certain person to want to sit in those deep, dark pieces, especially like the one part of the field that I will give props to is like trauma children's therapists.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't do it.
I did it for a period of time in like my work, and it was the hardest like piece of just like listening to a 5-year-old talk about some heinous stuff. And I was like,
there's a place for everybody. That's why there's therapists who are able to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I need my accountant to do my taxes because I don't know how to do numbers.
Michelle, I love you. Yeah.
Michelle, if you're out there, you're a real one and you know it. Hey, how about Sky from Germany? How much do we love that name? 1 through 10?
10.
10, for sure. All 10's around. Do you? I'm going to summarize a bit, and I never do the little disclosure that we edit down your thoughtful questions just to protect you a bit. So we kind of summarize, but we always appreciate you asking them. But do you think families can heal from trauma as well? I get triggered, and I don't know what I need to finally have the feeling we've moved forward and it's over. I'm scared of doing EMDR and then things possibly happening again. Is this something I could possibly discuss with my family? There's layers to this one, but thinking about families hearing from trauma, wondering, should I go to trauma therapy? Is it over? I know these are questions people have.
And I know that there are deep fears that people have too, which are valid. You know, you want to know with some level of certainty that you'll get better or that it'll help or you won't be in the same place. And I totally get that. And I think even just with any sort of trauma therapy, y'all were describing it really beautifully before of like, you share all these thoughts with a complete stranger and it's vulnerable and you got to trust them. Right. But I think when it comes to families, I do think that there's absolutely room for families to heal from trauma. I think it depends on everybody's ability to access that or willingness and stuff like that. And even if you're in a family who might not be maybe open to these conversations, you could still certainly heal on your own too. You know, family affairs are hard. And I know, I'm just speaking from personal experience with my own family trauma. It feels like it's hard to gain closure unless everybody's kind of on the same page. And that's not necessary for your growth, or healing journey, all that stuff. But I think, Sky, to answer I think it was like your second question about, can you openly discuss this with your parents? I hate to be that psychologist that says it depends, but it really does. It really depends on your safety, how safe you feel within the relationship. I don't know how y'all feel about that too.
Yeah. I think when we go into our healing journey, like the thing is we can't control if bad things happen in the future. We cannot control. We might be able to like pivot if we start to see it coming, but sometimes things happen out of the blue and we can't control them. What I have found is with starting that healing journey, again, speaking from experience, is I'm actually better equipped to handle those traumatic events. Now, because I've gained the skills to help me kind of move through my past trauma, to help me when things come up now in the present, I have those skills still. Is it fair that maybe bad shit happens to me as an adult now? No. But can I control that? No. And so I always say, like, I mean, you could keep putting off your healing for the rest of your life for fear that bad things are going to happen or continue or anything like that. But you can also start doing some of that work now, to help mitigate and again, be able to maybe change your, that world perception in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is it's not to say you should go in with this expectation, but don't sell short you healing or starting your healing journey, how that may impact in a positive way the family dynamic. I think a lot of times one person doing the work sets off dominoes, and I've seen this before in other family members self-reflecting, going inside and starting their healing journey as well. Again, it's not to set the expectation, but in things that we often witness as mental health professionals, I would say that's a phenomenon I see a lot, is one member starts healing and other people also start their journey. Mila. It's either Mila or Mila. Both are great. We enjoy both. Wherever you are out in the world, How can we deal with the severe separation anxiety from parents due to trauma? I just feel like no one talks about this, and I feel very alone and ashamed in my struggle with this. What do y'all think about this, of separation anxiety often being paired or sometimes being paired with trauma?
I've seen this a lot. Once again, my trauma worldview a lot of times is medical. So first, I'm going to say, Mila, you're not alone. It's nothing to be ashamed of. So I can think of many times where granted, I work with children and adolescents where maybe something bad happens when a parent has been out of the hospital, and like they're hospitalized for something. But with regard to like dealing with it, and I don't know your situation, but as somebody that has worked with separation anxiety in the past, things like having a comfort item from your parents or somebody that you feel separation from, gradually exposing yourself to longer separation. So an example, this wouldn't apply to you necessarily. Like I said, I don't know your specific circumstance, but hopefully you can take this and apply it to your life. Is, if I have a teen that's really anxious about being alone in the hospital, understandably, due to separation anxiety related to medical trauma, first we might have the parent, go downstairs and get some food while somebody's in the room with them. And then when that's comfortable, with parent go for an hour-long walk while, they're in the room or doing an activity. And then that gradually gets to like the parent goes home for a day and then a night, and, having things like knowing that you can call them if the fear is coming from like something bad is going to happen to me or my parent or guardian when we are separated, trying to, and this is more of a cognitive strategy, like remind yourself, hey, the last time they were gone, nothing bad happened, and kind of building up that evidence that we can be away, have phone calls, things like that. But that's where I would start, at least like that gradual approach, if possible, for your current circumstances.
I hope you can talk about it too. I hope in the traumas I've been through, I know they're directly tied to like death and loss, but just being able to openly like tell my mom, like, now I'm worried you're going to pass away or die or something's going to happen to you. I think those conversations helped a lot for me, of just being able to recognize name. But yeah, totally everything just said, the gradual approach makes a lot of sense. Bree from Florida. Hi, Bree. I just said hi to you out my window. Do you have any thoughts about why PTSD symptoms may not appear immediately after the traumatic experience? Sometimes a year or more later. What's up with that?
Yeah. Some people could have delayed expression. So they might not meet full criteria, even though maybe some symptoms would be there, some immediate symptoms, but then it might not actually, experience all the symptoms until later. In terms of why, I could think of a couple of different theories, but the one that comes to mind for me in terms of what I see with my own clients is life is stressful. There's a lot going on. And sometimes we don't really understand, or not understand, we don't really appreciate the gravity of our symptoms until we're able to actually fully process them. So we might be going through life and maybe not even realizing that we're experiencing these symptoms, or we might be experiencing them and avoiding them. So many things could be true, but those are the two that I noticed the most.
I was also going to say just like shock.
Yeah.
Or like kind of going into autopilot depending on the specific trauma. Once again, my worldview comes from medical. Like I have seen this a lot where, a kid or teen comes in for like a gunshot wound. Not only is their body in shock, but they're like in the hospital. They're just trying to literally survive, that they don't have time to process what actually happened to them. And then they might go to rehab or things like that. And it's not till they're like back in the quote unquote real world that they may start experiencing some of those symptoms.
Love it. Melissa from Somewhere Only We Know. They said I had to. I'm sorry. It's just such a good song.
It's a
Pretty solid song.
K10 has no idea what that song is. I bet you 10 out of 10.
I'm trying real hard. I don't. Can somebody sing it?
Yo, we're gonna lose.
Right. I'll look it up later.
If I sing it, we're gonna lose group members.
Okay.
Spotify's gonna jam it.
We'll table that.
Melissa needs some encouragement here, is what it felt. But I love that so much. What advice do you have for someone at the start of trauma therapy and wanting to do EMDR, but they're terrified? Someone who fears that they won't be able to get through it, let alone have post-traumatic growth, because this fear just runs so deep and life feels so dangerous. Such a valid feeling.
Having that conversation with your provider is the biggest key, because a lot of these trauma modalities, like the goal isn't to like X Games mode through your trauma. Like if you need to take it slow and steady, like take it slow and steady. And like you have to tell your therapist, hey, this is going too fast for me. Like I go back to when I'm working with clients, building that solid foundation of coping and education in order to then build on top of that. Because it is hard work. It is scary because again, like your body is like, oh shit, we're going to sit in this again. This already hurt the first time around and you're going to put me back in there. Like it makes you want to run in the other direction. So it's making sure like that you have a good relationship with your therapist and enough power. I think this is the biggest part, enough power in yourself to be able to speak up and say, whoa, let's pump the brakes a little bit. I'm not okay.
Love that. I couldn't agree more. Sort of related, Annie from Massachusetts. Can you share about how exposure therapy can help with PTSD recovery? Stimulus, response, habituation. Who would like to explain that?
You can.
I was going to say, Justin, you brought it up, but K10.
There's a stimulus. No, in all seriousness, our brain, especially if we're talking exposure therapy specifically, that usually works well with specific events where our visual cortex is being primed and all our senses. It could be smell, could be touch, could be a lot of things, but usually visual cortex is seeing something and priming the amygdala to go off, pop off, if you will, and put us in a fight or flight mode. And that's, again, directly related to the traumas we've been to. But in exposing people to these cues, to sight, smell, any sort of sensation, and then having them regulate, having them work through maybe the anxiety, the sweating, sometimes dissociation that may come up, in helping them ground themselves. Over time, this repeated exposure, people habituate to the stimuli out there. And that's really, really important, because what do? That we've talked about many times in this episode. We avoid. Avoidance keeps those triggers alive and well, which is why it's always interesting, the pro and the con of avoiding triggers. Therapeutically, we don't want to avoid triggers. We want to be in a safe environment, safe relationship to work through them to achieve this habituation where you could get in an automobile after an accident and not be, sweating, having a panic attack or whatever. But in the beginning, you might just start by looking at it, and then you might just sit in it. And then you might go for a short drive. And again, this is what we talk about, where we gradually build up and do different exposures, and they are very effective. Do you feel comfy doing them? No, which is the part why a lot of people get worried or triggered by thinking about exposure therapy. They usually think of the end of the road, of if you just got in a car accident, I'm going to get in a car and be driving down the highway. That's the end of the road. You got to remember there are many steps of exposure before that. And most therapists follow the gradual approach, working up a hierarchy.
I love that.
Amanda, Nova Scotia.
That's close to me.
Nova Scotia.
Nova.
Just Nova. We're going to go with Nova.
That's closer to me than you.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I'm like, Nova Scotia is closer to me than any of you. than I am to any of you.
That's absolutely
also true.
We don't even know. You might be in an opposite hemisphere as far as we're concerned.
Oh my God.
Is there a difference in how PTSD can present in emergency service workers who are used to functioning in high stress environments versus non-emergency service workers? Does the ability to compartmentalize in being a quote helper play a role in PTSD presentation or have any effect on how well current therapeutic interventions will work for these individuals? Fascinating question. They also added hashtag Team Candy Corn F yeah.
Yes.
We all know
I actually wrote in. I wrote in F yeah as like a thank you, Amanda.
You did, Amanda. I did not say F yeah, but we know who did.
I did. Oh man. Do you mind if I take this one?
Please.
Not at all.
Okay.
Please take it.
Yeah. So I was an EMT for 5 years. So I'll speak from like personal experience. And then also I do provide therapy for service workers, especially emergency service workers. And the one thing that I've noticed is it's hard for most of us to start our journey, to really work through our trauma and really work through, all the things that we've seen, heard, smelled, all these things, when you're still actively in that role. And I notice for when I provide therapy for people who are emergency service workers and maybe non-emergency service workers or people who are in a different field, the one notable trait that I notice the most is that I have to go so slow with my clients who are actively in the ambulance or, they're in the ER or something like that, because I think the fear is that, oh my gosh, if I open up my emotions, I'm not going to be effective. And I mean, technically you might be right in some sense when we're just starting out. I think a lot of people want to talk about all the things that they've seen and heard, and it's really, really difficult. And then they might say, oh my God, have you seen it? I don't know anybody else who has seen this other than my friends and all this stuff. So we go really, really, really slow. Like Justin was saying, the gradual exposure. And then I noticed too, I always ask, what sort of things do you want to work on first? What would be the easiest? Because if you're constantly on the ambulance and you're in maybe a high crime area and you see gunshots and stab wounds a lot, right? And maybe you had a trauma from a really long time ago that is completely unrelated on the ambulance, we might start with that one because you're not seeing that every single day. If you're actively still seeing it, then you're technically reducing your avoidance because you're exposing yourself unintentionally to the thing that is causing the most trauma. But I think the cool thing about actually starting therapy when you are an emergency service worker is that, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. I wish I would have done it sooner. I really do. Because I think that the aftermath, when you hang up your badge and you say, I'm done, it's still going to be there. So you may as well get ahead of it. And if you're actually in the moments with these patients and all that stuff, it actually will help you get through it a little quicker. And I think a lot of people are fearful because they don't think it's going to be helpful. Again, everybody looks at this differently, just speaking from personal experience and just my own experience as a clinician. But I just want to say thanks for your service as well, if you are a medic. But yeah, going slow, talking around what therapy will look like before you actually jump in would also be helpful. But in terms of therapeutic interventions, a lot of times we are doing exposure therapy with response prevention just inadvertently just because of your job, which technically could be helpful. And prolonged exposure is also another one that we use, but every clinician is different. I hope that helped.
Well, and I think too, like you said, K10, like every person is so different.
They are.
I can speak for my husband. My husband is a dispatcher. Aww. And his mentality, like he literally is like, yes, there are some calls that affect me when they hit a little too close to home. Yeah. But for him, and again, his mentality is like, at the end of the day, if I got the people there, I did my job.
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about, and for him, he talks about when, like, I want to talk about feelings. So when he comes home and I can see his behavior shift, I'm like, hey, you have a hard call today and we'll talk about it. But for him, like, serving time in the Marine Corps and then going and doing this, like, he's very good at kind of having, like, really sitting in logic mind about it and just saying, like, I did my job. And that's really hard. Like, he gets a benefit because he's sitting kind of detached from it versus, sometimes like EMTs, ER doctors, police officers, that type of thing.
I I also think it's harder for dispatchers too, because they hear so much and they can't do anything about it.
Well, and they never
it's so difficult.
They rarely find out what happens afterwards.
They don't.
Too.
Yes, that's the hardest part, I think.
Every once in a while, they may get a call from a family that says, hey, we would just want to thank you so much. But a lot of times, like, sometimes even on the bigger calls, they don't know what happens until they see it in the news.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really hard. And a lot of times, like, my husband's job wasn't deemed first responders in the state of Maine until like 2 or 3 years ago. They weren't considered first responders, which, again, their response is different in the capacity of what their role is, but they are in that line. They are the first.
And I think you make a good point too about the compartmentalization, which I think if you're thinking about people in this field, I mean, they're really, really good at compartmentalizing the moment, and I think for people who are dispatchers, ER docs, things like that, I mean, you could always practice outside of your job too. Like if there is a trauma that you've experienced in your personal life, you could always start with that one and just kind of test the waters and see how you respond, if you're worried.
And everybody's just going to be different in how, like, again, their impact of their worldview is going to look different. Like, I joke with my husband, I'm like, you couldn't identify an emotion from a rock. And I say this to him, so it's not, I say this to him all the time.
I love Ben.
But I'm like, dude, we need to work on this emotional identification. But like, for him in that job, in a way that serves him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because he can really, like, he's really good at separating a lot of those things and knowing like what he can and can't control. Now, in other aspects, not great, but that's like, again, everybody is so different. And I really like what you said, K10, of like, getting ahead of it is better than trying to pick up the pieces 20 years down the road.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. Claire from Louisiana wants to know, what exactly does it mean to be trauma informed? This is kind of cool, because I like Claire is, a lot of times as mental health professionals, we can be like, oh, all these buzzwords that everybody on TikTok likes. Well, what about us, huh? Look in the mirror a little bit, mental health professionals. What do we actually mean by trauma informed? We love to say it. No one defines it. How can you tell if a provider is trauma informed? How can professionals outside the mental health field be trauma informed? So somebody shine a light for Claire.
I literally just went on a rant about this in my orientation. Being trauma informed. So being trauma informed, anybody listening to this specific podcast, you're now considered trauma informed because you know about trauma.
Jeez Louise.
That's literally, it's just being informed about trauma. It's how you carry that out. That is what is the most important. So are you truly trauma informed in the capacity of, are you paying attention to the behaviors and where they're stemming from? Are you truly coming and approaching a client and maybe their resistance to treatment and understanding the impact of their history and really sitting in that and finding the balance of those two? That's my problem when I hear like all of these individuals say, like, I'm trauma informed, I'm trauma informed, I'm trauma informed. And I'm like, well, what trauma training do you have? And they're like, well, I took a class in college. And I'm like, okay. I really struggle with that buzzword because everybody is trauma informed, technically speaking. The difference is are you trauma I like to say trauma integrated. And is that integrated into your practice and the way that you present your treatment with clients?
I like that idea of trauma integrated. I've never heard that, because I think it makes sense, because, and I don't know, I don't know if this is like an unpopular opinion or what, but like, I almost feel like if you're a therapist, you like have to be trauma informed. Like you can't, like, how do you not, whether or not you're taking trainings, but I think just knowing how, like KBI is saying, like knowing how trauma impacts people differently. I mean, I'm even thinking based on culture, socioeconomic status, all these things, religion. I mean, I think all that's so important. I don't know, but I could be wrong. I'm not sure.
And like what you said, K10, like it's why I just don't think, like, for me, I'm like, oh, you're trauma informed, like every other therapist should be.
Yeah.
To me, it's not anything special until you integrate it. So
you're not special.
Sorry, it's my hot. It's like my hill. I'll die on.
I love it.
Well, and I think there's a big difference between being trauma informed and trauma trained. Like we are informed about trauma. Going through grad school, like you learn about trauma, hopefully trauma related symptoms, what trauma responses can look like, how the individual's environment, background, things like that can impact trauma and trauma impact that, versus being like formally trained in modalities. And I think also some other things when I think of being trauma informed, especially beyond like mental health providers, because I know that was part of the question as well, is that like creating a safe environment for people to be able to talk about their trauma, reducing the risk of re-traumatization. Like I see that as somebody that works in a hospital, we have restraints at the hospital if absolutely necessary, but we do not use them because it is well known that restraints can re-traumatize individuals, especially that have been victims of sexual assault. Now, there are some necessary times if the individual is going to hurt themselves or others, and it's this whole long process. But even things like, if we have a female patient come in who has a history of sexual assault or sexual violence by a male perpetrator, recognizing that a male physician going in is probably not going to be the safest and could re-traumatize. So with regard to, I think it was like the third part of the question from Claire, how can professionals outside the mental health field be more trauma informed? There are specific trauma informed trainings for healthcare workers, for teachers. I feel like a lot of schools, at least I've heard in this area from teachers, do trauma-informed trainings, especially if you think of like the kids acting out in class. Oh, we're going to label them as defiant. No, that could be a trauma response. So Claire, I don't know what field you are in, but you can look up trauma-informed training specifically for healthcare workers, teachers, even businesses and things like that. But I think at the basic, it's being aware of what trauma is, what trauma symptoms are, how to create a safe environment, skills-based approach, viewing things through a sociocultural lens, all of the things we've already highlighted.
Love it. Soteria. Did I look up how to pronounce your name? And I probably still butchered it. Soteria from Greece. All the way from Greece.
Ooh.
A lot of people ask the first part of your question. So we're going to do a first part, second part. We're all going to answer it. How can I help someone with PTSD? Love so many of you asked that. Second part though, simple things I can do that can help my PTSD. I'll do a first part, second part. First part, I'd say providing a safe space for people. And again, as we talk about trauma informed, validating and understanding that people have gone through trauma and their responses to it can vary. Having a safe space where you can validate someone's experience. You don't have to become their trauma therapist. But again, often it's just kind of being like providing a safe, validating space. It's not enough. It often is enough. It often is enough in being a good friend. Second thing, a thing I would highly recommend that we've kind of touched on a little bit for your own PTSD, never stop being curious about what regulates you. So many angles you can go with PTSD. I think when we get stuck in avoidance, we get stuck in many different ways. We adapt in the short run into the long run with trauma. One thing I always want people to get curious about is like what allows you to be present and again, grounded in the moment. If you can learn how to regulate yourself, it's going to help your PTSD treatment. It's going to help you move in and out of triggers. It's going to help you overall live a more, I know this is the buzzword, balanced life, but that is super important and it's not easy. Some people assume they should just know what regulates you. No, I think you got to experiment. I think you got to try new things and you got to learn to pay attention to your body. there's many classic examples of this, from artwork to listening to music to meditation and yoga, of course. But if you could get curious about that, I think it would help you as far as the simple thing goes. 1-2 parts. What y'all got?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Justin. I would say the only thing I would add to the first part of like creating that safe space validating is active listening and not inserting like yourself into their narrative. And I know a lot of us do this unintentionally and not with malintent, but like we hear something and we want to like try to be relatable and be like, oh, I totally understand, you know, when X, Y, or Z happened. But, you know, helping somebody is really like listening to their story and, just listening, validating, and not inserting yourself or not trying to fix it unless they actually ask for tangible skills.
I was thinking the exact same thing. I keep thinking about the nail video when she has the nail in her head, and how he's like trying to fix it, and she's like, "I need you to listen," like that sort of thing. But you could Google it. But the one thing that I'm thinking about too is that like kind of what Justin said about like trying to ground yourself, and I try to verbalize it to my clients, like, how do you feel more at home in your body? And are you feeling unsafe or uncomfortable? And helping people kind of distinguish the difference with PTSD and trauma. I think it is really hard sometimes. It gets blurred. Like, am I really in an unsafe situation, or am I very uncomfortable with the trigger because it reminds me of a lot? So I think trying to make that distinction and helping people through that is good. And then the other thing that I would say is, if somebody with trauma is describing their experience to you, it's so sacred. That's just such a deep thing. And even if you're not interested and you're tired and all these other things, at least appearing like you're listening would be great. Just because it's so heavy for people and it is hard to even verbalize these things.
Well, and I think for individuals, like going off of that, Katan, like as someone who has talked to someone who is disinterested, sometimes it's better to say, hey, I want to listen to this. I don't have the space for it right now. Can we do this at another time? Because I truly want to be able to show up for you. I find that, like, yes, that might put the person off, absolutely, but that will do, if it does do quote unquote damage, it's going to do less damage than you just being like, than seeing so disinterested. And being able to create that space that just says, hey, I want to be here for you, but right now, like, I'm falling asleep and I want to make sure that I give you the attention that this deserves. Because I think sometimes with trauma, like, people feel so alone. And then when they come up against someone who just seems so disinterested, it just furthers that narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's hard.
Yeah. I like that modeling though. Cause we can't always, the word I'm looking for is like be in the right state of mind or energy. Like, we fluctuate. Like, even us as therapists, like, I'm not always the best listener. I'm not always, in the right mindset to connect. And I think it's unrealistic to say we should be. So KBI, I love that you added that one. That's really good. Alexis and Tegan, you've never met each other because one of you is in South Carolina, the other's in Pennsylvania, but I like these questions that you asked. We're going to combine them a little bit here, but essentially, how long does it take to notice change in PTSD symptoms? And how can I know I'm making progress?
I think Jess said it before, but kind of recognizing how far you've come. Like, if you look back, and I think the one thing that my own therapist does for me really, really often is she kind of highlights the moments of growth for me, even if I can't see it. And it really, really helps. And again, it's different for everybody. Everybody's, PTSD looks different, different symptoms. Not everybody has flashbacks. Some people do, right? So I think it'll look different for everybody. And you won't really know if you're getting better unless you really try to take a good look at how far you've come and where you started. I think that's really helpful, getting some data or even just reflecting. That's where I would go with it.
And I think too, it's like, again, like acknowledging those baby steps. So let's say that every time you walk into the grocery store, you have a flashback. But today I walked in the grocery store, but it was actually 10 minutes into the grocery store that I had a flashback instead of immediately walking in. Like that's progress. And like sometimes I think as we're on our healing journey, we so desperately want to feel better. We so desperately don't want to feel the pain or the symptoms that we forget to see like that 10 minutes was progress.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, KBI, because one of the things I say to my patients in the hospital a lot is if you can find one small thing in every day that you're here, even if you feel like today was a lot worse of a day than yesterday, there still is going to be something that is, you know, growth and change. Even I would argue like even showing up to therapy is you making progress. Even if you don't feel like, and this is assuming therapy is accessible to you, like even if you don't feel like a lot is changing, you are taking active steps to change. And who knows, maybe it's, you know, the symptoms are still present, but they last a shorter period of time, or you're able to bounce back, or you're able to use your coping skills more readily than you were before. And this is a cliche too, but like healing is not linear. There's going to be some harder days and some better days, and, you know, taking inventory. I've had individuals that will like keep a journal for the sole purpose of being able to look back on how far they've come, even if they feel like on the day to day, not much has changed, but then they look back and they're like, oh my gosh, like I don't even remember how bad I was because I still feel bad, but looking back, they're able to be like, wow, I actually have made a lot of growth and progress.
Yeah, I love the idea of charting that journey because Alexis, in the first part of like, how long does it take? There's just so much variability. And I know I hate saying this, but yes, I've seen people make almost immediate changes after one session. And I've seen people, again, it's ongoing. They've made changes in areas that they didn't expect to make. And some of their symptoms kind of linger. But it's the main question is like, are you able to move forward with your hopes, dreams, and not be pulled into, like we've tried to express many times throughout this episode, of not be pulled into avoidance that leads you away to living your daily life? Because that is the thing, whether it's because of the flashbacks, the dissociation, you know, mood swings, it's when you're not able to move forward with the things you want to do with your life. That is at the hallmark of when PTSD is the most problematic. But that's important to remember because, as we've talked about, you might still feel irritable at times. You might still have triggers at times. That doesn't mean you haven't progressed. Again, can't echo enough. I love the way of chronicling our healing journey. Because when you look back and you read some of those entries in your journal, you're going to be like, oh, yeah. And your therapist can remind you, but there is something about your own words and seeing it there. I think we're down the dusty road.
Are we?
What?
Those are some really great questions. I love that.
What does
down the dusty?
What?
I'm just like, Justin's like,
Heard of that?
No.
Justin's like
Time
in
to
New
hit the
Mexico
dusty
somewhere.
road.
It is time to hit the
That's
dusty
an
road
Ohio
and
thing.
wrap this thing up. Get you off to bed because I don't know what's happening in Florida.
Oh my God.
Listen, some of you didn't play Oregon Trail and it shows.
I did, but I don't
Yeah,
remember
I died
that.
of dysentery within 5 minutes every time.
I always died of that. I know.
Listen,
Or I
you're out
drowned my
hunting.
family in the lake or the river.
You're
Is that
collecting
where your
yours.
water trauma started from?
Probably.
The Oregon Trail.
I just felt like
Probably.
that game like never ended. Like it just felt so long. Like I don't know why. It was just like the longest game of eternity.
Imagine how people felt in the action.
Literally, they were probably trucking for days, and they're like, "Fuck, this is years." They didn't know the time. The time had passed. Oh my god!
PTSD for days. PTSD for
We
days.
just all showed our millennial colors at the end
Oh
of this
my
episode.
god! I have so many thoughts. Yeah, just do the outro, KBI, please. Get us out.
We're on the Oregon
guys-
Trail right now.
We really are.
Right, we're somewhere, that's for sure. Definitely not on the outro, but let's bring us back. Again, thank you all for showing up this week. We appreciate each and every single one of you. As you know, every week we leave you with a reflection question that we post over on our Instagram. And this week our question is, what is a step that you can take this week to move forward in your healing? So make sure you head over to our social media. Let us know in the comments how you're going to do that this week, big or small. We'd love to hear it. And make sure that you like, rate, and subscribe to the episode. That helps us tremendously. It also keeps you guys up to date on when our episodes go live. You can also apparently subscribe on Instagram for when our posts go live. Okay. So you won't miss when we post to our stories, so you don't miss Sunday polls or the Sunday questions. You won't miss the reflection question or all the really cool things we're doing over there. So make sure you do that. And yeah, can't wait to see you guys next week in group.
Bye.
Bye.
Peace.